Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of SEPA Paranormal Chronicles. And I am joined today by my regular co-host Megan. Say hello, Megan.
Hi.
And our special guest today is Chris Stiles, who is a UFO investigator and a UFO researcher. Welcome, Chris.
It's good to be here, Lee.
Perfect. So I know that you're extremely famous, if we can say that, with about the Shag Harbour incident. But before we get into that, can you please tell me how you first got involved with UFO investigating?
Well, it was in the early 90s. It would have been April 1992 that led to me coming in. And what it was strangely, I'd always had a general layman's interest in it, as many people do, in the topic, right, over the years, but it never belonged to a group. Have read classic books like The UFO Experience by Alan Hynek, treated the premise, the questions very seriously, but had no direct involvement. But in 1992, I was watching a rerun of Unsolved Mysteries with a girlfriend. And this was my first time, believe it or not, I'd heard of the Roswell incident. And it was that segment that was on there that involved people like Kevin Randall, Stanton Friedman, etc. in the production. And we watched the story. And when it was over, my friend said, "Do you think such a thing is possible? Like, is it?" And of course, I had my memories of the Shag Harbour incident. And I said, "I know it can be because it happened here." And I started telling my story. And she encouraged me. She said, "The fellow that was on there, the nuclear physicist, which of course was the late Stanton Friedman," she said, "he lives in Fredericton, New Brunswick now. Her parents and her family were from there." So I'm like, "Well, yeah." And she said, "You should call him." I said, "Yeah, I'll do that." And she knew me well and said, "No, you won't. You say that, but you'll never get around to it." And she grabbed the old landline, and set it in my lap. And I have to say, Double Dog dared me to call him. So in those days, without having, of course, a cell or a computer, what I did was call the long distance operator, ask if there was a number for Stanton. To my surprise, there was a listed number. I took it.
Wow.
I called the number, and I was immediately answered by a human answering service. And they told me that it was out of town, but if it was an emergency, they had a contact number. And before I could answer, the girlfriend hollered that it was, "We'll take the number." And I called the number, and Stanton, and it turned out, never checked, the number, the location or area code. I was phoning Austin, Texas. And he was about to leave a hotel and go to a MUFON symposium to do a presentation. Flying saucers are real. But he took the time out right there and talked to me for almost half an hour. And I told him my memory. I didn't have a date or anything of the Shag Harbour incident. And when I more or less got through my story, he said, "Chris, I think you're in luck. You sound like the kind of guy that might pursue this." And he said, "That should be easier than what I did at Roswell." And he gave me some very simple pointers. And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Fishermen don't move." The real
Yeah.
basic investigative things. And he gave me a number of pointers like that and said, "I have some friends that might remember the case." He didn't remember it, never heard of it. Stanton Friedman, crash scenarios, had never heard of Shag Harbour. That's how it had slipped into what I call the dustbin of history. So anyway, I did all the things he told me. He sent me an application to the Fund for UFO Research. Things happened quickly. I was on my way to Ottawa for 2 weeks, found a bunch of paperwork, and I was out of the blocks. And that was how, and it just kept building momentum from there.
So would you say that you are one of the top specialists in Canada with regard to UFOs?
I'm perhaps one of the most successful in terms of getting, the paper trail out, and interviewing, getting people to talk to me face to face. I had a background in market research, and I used to do a lot of major clients for some of the big companies here in terms of, and I think that was a good sort of, preparation for what I did. because the next thing you know, I was able to talk and sit down to people like top Canadian admirals, the former head of Canada's air desk, Squadron Leader William Bain in Ottawa, and where other people had failed to engage with them. Right, I had a lot of face, CEOs of bases, defense ministers. I seem to be very lucky and, get them to open up to me. So between that and the paper trail I was unearthing on cases like Shag Harbour, and not just Shag Harbour, that's what I'm best known for, but there were many satellite cases and things since, like in my sort of blurb, I always say that, I'm known for that, but I also look into classic cases like and current ones too. But the thing is with the classic cases, often you have a great starting point because we have a great thing in Canada here. There's a heritage of RCMP involvement. And, they don't do anything on the force without generating paper, right? You fill the gas tank, you fill out paper. And unlike, say, a county sheriff in the state of Maine or something, you don't have this option. You can't, when you get a call. I love some of the early reports actually say they start at the top and it says complaint of UFO. When somebody has a landing case or a close encounter complaint, but they come in as a disinterested third party and investigate it as seriously as they would if it was a murder, armed robbery, etc., serious car accident. And it's a great heritage and a great paper trail that I found I've been able to exploit because I start with that. Particularly the early reports are great because before the Privacy Act, they don't blot out phone numbers, addresses, names, right?
Yeah,
And
Yeah.
I often track these people down or the surviving relatives, quite often the people themselves, and sit them down and reinvestigate in depth and ask the questions that weren't asked. And it's an advantage that I think Canadians have, and it's helped me.
absolutely. Perfect.
How do you find from when you first started investigating UFOs until now, how do you find the different in like reportings and sightings nowadays?
Well, it's all too easy now, isn't it? People can go
Yes.
online, right? And
Right.
in a sense, I can remember in the beginning, I used to find the odd researcher that was, starting to say things like, oh, it's too easy or there's too many reports. And I used to say, well, how strange. I didn't understand that, but now I do. You know,
Yeah.
it used to be a great filter, like before the internet. I don't know for many people now that sounds funny, but I remember before there was an internet, but it wasn't really useful. Actually, I remember before the internet too. But to be fair, I'm 69 now. I remember when there wasn't none, except within the military. But yeah, the thing is, in the old days, there was a great filter and a number you used to hear all the time in UFO research, which was that perhaps when you get a report, like a police report or a military report, and it gave a number, and let me just go to Shag Harbour, of course, where initially there were
Yeah.
7 witnesses that night. They called the nearby RCMP detachment, Barrington Passage, from different locations. Well, you would take that number and you could safely assume that there were at least 70 witnesses. You would multiply by 10. This is before the internet because not everybody would have the gumption or know to pick up that phone and dial the Rescue Coordination Center or the RCMP, police, right? Or a nearby military base or even a radio station. Whereas nowadays you can just click, Google something up and file a report. You're connected to the world and, it'll
Yeah.
search and do whatever. So it's hard to say the numbers have less meaning that way, but it's not that they don't have meaning, but it's a lot harder to interpret. In a way, it's almost too easy. So everybody will report what they think they've seen. And to go back to another old adage, which I've certainly found to be true in my work, is that people are great observers, but they're bad interpreters.
Yeah.
People see things all the time. And you would be surprised, even people who you would think would be good at interpretation. I've had many professional and commercial pilots call and report something. And here I am now, wow, using the internet. And while I'm talking to them on a telephone call, I'm opening a program, like heavensabove.com. And I'm saying, what time was that again? Oh, yes, I wrote it down. I was looking in this direction. I say, well, you saw the ISS pass over. Are you sure? They go, oh, yes, I'm sure, And they'll tell me something like, well, it rose, in the southeast and went northwest, and there was no cloud cover. They go in. I was flying in at 10,000 feet, and I could see that this thing was going across the sky, and it was bright as could be. I could see every star. There was no cloud, and all of a sudden, it very quickly faded out when it got 3/4 of the way across. What did it do? Did it go stealth, or did it burn up? Or I go, it entered the Earth's shadow. So uh, you know, again, you would think, but I mean, so it's not just a question of people that know little to nothing about it. And often when you look at the classic cases, here's another thing I got to find. And I think sometimes researchers, and good researchers generally, run into these limitations. We all have. I've certainly made mistakes. It happens. It's just so easy. But when you go back, for example, like say you got a case and it's looking good, and you find old media reports, and you'll read in the newspaper that two amateur astronomers, observed this for however long. You track down and find the two amateur astronomers, and you find, in fact, they were just two men with a telescope, not the same thing. Okay.
100%.
So that's right. So you have to sift through that. And, it's one thing to have the data, but often when mistakes are made, they get eternally passed on through media, through books, through, second, third treatment sort of thing. So you have to go back, even in classic cases, and question everything. This is something I quickly learned, the pitfalls, right, of the mistakes of others. They accumulate, they snowball.
That's it. And it's very easy to misinterpret nowadays because you've got the SpaceX train. Once the
Sure.
satellites have been launched, you've got
Mm-hmm.
Chinese lanterns, you've got drones,
That's
and
right.
people are far too quick to say, oh, that's a UFO, where there's a natural explanation for it.
Yeah. Yeah, and here on the coast, I live in what I call the tailpipe of North America, better known as Nova Scotia. And I've seen things myself that for a day, it took me some time to figure out. I'll tell you one real quick, strange little one that it was in the winter, and I can't remember what year it was. It was about, would have been in the 80s now. And I was coming in the Lawrencetown Road here along the coast, and I got up on a big hill, and I looked out to sea, and I could see the horizon, and it was coming into dusk. Right, there was still, diffuse light on the horizon. You could see things quite plain, but it was getting dark. It was near sunset, and I'm looking east, so the sun's not in my eyes, and I see a horizon, but then I see a second horizon above it. And I could clearly tell, and I watch things all the time and living on the coast here, a fog bank, a cloud bank, I've even watched total eclipses here over the years and that. But it was really striking. And when you stood on that hill alone and I looked out, it was almost disorienting. The brain didn't want to accept what you were seeing. But here were two perfectly straight horizons, right? One above the other. Well, I thought, it could be some kind of, trick of light or whatever. But, it puzzled me. I got in the car, I drove away, and I had no idea what it was and was trying to think the next day, got up and was trying to figure now, how will I figure out what that was? What are the possibilities, and grabbed some books. But when I opened my living room window that also provided a view of the ocean, and I looked out like the harbor, something I'd never seen, and nobody, even people that were in their 80s and 90s and had seen, the Halifax Harbor was filled with pack ice. We'd never had it here. We're the northernmost ice-free port, and it was a freak of wind pattern that blew it down from Iceberg Alley, and it blocked us in for about 3 days. The Coast Guard kept running in and out of the harbor in case a naval ship had to be dispatched on a mission. I'd never seen it, but in the distance, it just looked like two lines, right? A true anomaly, but quite natural, right?
Yeah. So Chris, obviously in this day and age, everybody knows how vast the universe is.
Mm-hmm.
And this may sound a really strange question, but why do you think that these UFO cases? Obviously, we don't get reports from other planets, so that's kind of a little bit of a like a unknown entity there. But
We have one from one. We do.
okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, and NASA acknowledges that. Back, it was the one of the first little, what were the pair? Not Opportunity, the other one, Spirit, right? On Mars, it
right.
captured a shot um, of the atmosphere, and there's something streaking across, and it's they don't believe it was a meteor or whatever. And at the time, there were only 10 man-made objects orbiting Mars. Various surveyors and rocket boosters or whatever, right? And right on the NASA website, in this shot, you'll see it. It says first UFO picture from another world,
Oh
and
wow,
they could not account for it. And they were quite clear that there were only 10 objects, and the orbits would not account for any of these. And that is how, and that's why I say that. So there's the case. There was a shot taken by Spirit, and according to NASA, they said they don't know what it is and couldn't figure it out, and they called it a UFO.
that's cool.
That is.
Hmm.
Go, Megan.
But
So do
but yeah,
you think that
So, oh, sorry.
go
no,
Carry
go
on,
no,
Chris.
go right ahead. I love the
Do you
questions.
think that UFOs and aliens are frequently coming to Earth and coming and going, or do you think they've already settled in Earth? On Earth, I should say.
That's the big kind of question, that used to really engage me and puzzle me and drive me, and it no longer does.
Okay.
Because it's all interesting, and when you think about it, either possibility, look, if you just answer, and I'm not ducking this at all, I'm going to come back to it
No.
more specifically. But if you ask the biggest and simplest of questions, like, are we alone? There's two answers, isn't there?
Yes.
And both of them are diametrically opposed, couldn't be further apart. One is we are alone, and the other is no, we aren't. And both of these are daunting. They are just, the implications run deep either way. It's just as deep. If we're alone, what a waste, human behavior and all the budgets on Earth that are spent toward defending invisible borders that have little to no meaning other than to cause hardship and death and destruction. Terrible way. And of course, if we are alone, if we are not alone, where do we fit into the picture? And are they here? And I certainly think that that's possible, and it's easy to think it's likely. I've been lucky enough to have two significant personal sightings in life, and even that number is significant. Most people I talk to that had a great sighting or an experience, right? When you meet them, one of the questions I always ask is, do you think you'll be lucky enough? Do you think it'll happen again? And most of them say, no, I don't think so. I don't feel that lucky. Well, I was one of those. And I was lucky enough on September the 15th, 2018, to be on Cape Sable Island here in Nova Scotia. And in the daytime, I started receiving numerous calls. I was in Yarmouth, about half-hour drive away, and I got to the area, and the numerous calls were telling me that there was a UFO over the island moving around. Now, this is 3 o'clock in the afternoon, not a cloud in the sky. The last great sunny, summery day that year we had in 2018, right? So I make my way as quick as I could to the area. And when I get there, the object's still there moving around. And what I'm seeing is basically what we think of now as one of the go fast things that have been reported from the deck of the carrier, the Theodore Roosevelt there in, what was it, 2014. Uh, and we had pictures and video taken. We have a sphere with a cube inside.
Yes.
And I got there for the last 7 minutes of it. And twice while making the observation, it disappeared and reappeared and would come closer to us. And I was lucky enough, I had a good pair of Steiner focus free binoculars with me. And on the last appearance, I had them right on and could look into this thing. And this was clearly, not It'd be a long list of what it wasn't. It was certainly not any kind of a drone or, it was just, it was staggering. And we had about 60 people on the beach watching this on a bright sunny day without a cloud in the sky. And when it would reappear, the whole crowd, you'd hear people go, "Oh," when it would reappear. It was very dramatic. It got a lot of press coverage here at the time. And I'll tell you, it's the oldest cliche in the book, seeing's believing. But if you had any doubts at that time, they would have been all washed away if you been there, right? And the interesting thing is that 7 minutes. And by the way, the total elapse of the sighting was an hour and 20 minutes. I got there for the last 7 minutes and it ended. And in that last 7 minutes, it was very dramatic. And I got to the point where I started observing the people around me, the various reactions. And it ran the full gambit and watching it. You need two things for a UFO experience. You need a UFO, you need a witness. And when I looked around, it was just as interesting to watch the people and the reaction. Some people shrugged and walked away. Others were terrified, dropped their belongings on the beach and ran for their car. Others became like almost oxygen drunk, hyperventilating, and were excited and euphoric. It was very dramatic what was going on around me. I was so lucky to be there and take this in, right? And some people, when I did follow up on this, like were unable to go back to work for a few days, and you could see strong psychological impact. I wrote it up and reported it to MUFON and other UFO groups. And like I say, it received some press down here and attention. But the trouble is nowadays, there's so much stuff on the internet. And, some would say, well, there's so much better videos and pictures than what you guys talk. Well, and by the way, when this thing got in close proximity, all that stuff went down. Like there was an EM effect, right? We do have some pretty fair video of it and that. But when it went down, that was it, right? When it got close. And ironically, that summer, I had filmed a documentary uh, nearby on the southwestern shore with the Cousteau grandchildren there, Celine and Fabien, right? And one day when I wasn't needed on the shoot, somebody called to report a UFO to me, and they told me the same kind of thing and took me to the same spot on a rainy day that day and told me, and this is someone who actually left her job in the community because of the trauma of the sighting. She was all alone on the beach at the time on an early summery day. And as this thing came close to her, she felt paralysis. And that was it. She was done with Cape Sable Island and southwestern Nova, So, but to catch it myself, it really recharged my batteries too, And, I could tell you so many academic type reasons and things in my research, compelling reports, people of high stature, politicians and defense ministers and people like that telling me their story. But, again, the old cliche, seeing is believing. And with the knowledge I've gained through the years reinvestigating cases, being up close and, try and keep in control, like I say, between watching the reaction on people, the EM effects and what I was seeing, with the binoculars I had. And, it just, I almost want to say it made me young again, but it
Sure.
sparked me, that's for sure. And I needed that at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you receive UFO and alien USO activity, how do you approach the reports when you get them?
Well, you mean current reports or cold cases
Yeah,
or?
yeah, any report, cold case, any when you get them, like when someone reports it to you, how do you go about it?
Well, the first thing I do is try to determine. Well, I take two things. First thing I try to figure out how many of the people are accessible or around, right? How much follow up can I do, right?
Yeah,
Because there's nothing like pressing the flesh and doing a face to face interview. If you can't do that, you do it by telephone or Zoom or whatever, right? If you can't do that, then you do an email. But the more up close and personal it is, the better. And I can give you, just a really great example. Like, I don't know how our time is, but there's a case that taught me this lesson better than anything in Lower Sackville, Nova Scotia. It happened in the 1970s. By the time it got in my hands, I found it in Stanton Friedman's basement, by the way, and he never had time to look into it. And when I started looking into it, it turned out to be the case. It's actually my favorite UFO case that I ever investigated, and few people know of it. I mentioned it in my last book there, Impact. My latest book, which is Sweep Clear 5, about the Shelburne USO incident, right? But when I see this, what happened in this case was I read it, and it's kind of a one-page report where the Mounties get a call from a woman, Mrs. Percy Webster. She's named in the report, so I'll use her name. It's all public. And she said, "Could you send someone to my house? There's a UFO over my house." A Mountie, a Constable Ferrand, is dispatched to it. He knocks on the door, and he opens up and he goes, "Yes, would you like to come out on the lawn with me?" He goes, "Actually, there's 3 UFOs over your house." And they step out. The RCMP officer stays for 2 hours. They're saying a 3-section kind of tic-tac shaped craft. And the middle section is like a tea strainer, and you can see into it, and there's green lights moving around. No sound. After 2 hours and drinking coffee with her, he says, "I got to leave on other duties." He said, "If you feel threatened or it gets closer, call us. We'll come back." So it's still there over the house, the 3 of them. The officer estimates them to be 500 feet above. Again, no noise. While he was here, he called the nearby radar tower at Halifax International, as it was known then, in the Shearwater base, the Naval Aviation Station there. And they were painting nothing on radar. He writes his little one-page report, which is what I have in my hand. And at the end, he mentions there's 2 neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Bedford next door, who also witnessed the event. So one day I had the report with me. I knock on Mrs. Webster's door in Lower Sackville. She opens up and I tell her who I am. "Oh," she said, "I'd love to talk to you." She tells me the story without embellishments, pretty much as it was in the report. I asked her, "Have you ever seen anything since?" "No, we often thought we did, but no, I don't think I'll be that lucky." That expression. So anyway, I said, "Do your neighbors still live next door, the Bedfords?" And she says, "Oh, yeah, but I think they're away right now." And she said, "It would do no good to talk to them." "Why?" She said, "Oh, they're belong to some kind of Christian cult, and they wouldn't say what they seen that way." And I said, "Well, I think I'll give it a try." I said, "I like to be complete." She said, "I think they're away. They usually go for the summer." I knocked on the door and got no answer. So when I went home, I kept calling the number. And 3 weeks later, Mr. Bedford, Robert Bedford, answered the phone. And I told him who I was and what I was looking for. And he says, "Whoa, I'll stop you right there." And I said, "Yeah, why?" And he said, "Because I've never seen a UFO or anything like that." Well, I said, "Well, your name's in an RCMP report. How would it get there?" And he said, "Fella, when did you say this was?" And I said, "Well, it was, October, 1976. And he's like, "I don't think we lived here then. I think we were still in Ontario." So I hear him holler for his wife, and she comes out. He's on an old landline in the hallway, right? A wall phone, as I will discover later on follow up. And he's saying, "Dear," and she goes, "Who is it? What is it?" He goes, "Oh, the Webster saw a UFO or something." He goes, "When did we come down from Ontario?" She said, "Oh, in the summer of 76. Well, he said, "Yeah, I guess we were there." Oh, he goes. And he suddenly, like something dawns on him, and he covers the phone. I can hear all this muffled talk. He comes back on and he says, "Yes, I know what you're talking about now. I'm sorry. And I shouldn't have said that about her neighbors." But he says, "Understand this, we don't get along." I didn't tell him I've been warned by Mrs. Webster. Now, this is all connected real soon here, as you'll see the significance. I said, "Yes." I said, "So you did see a UFO?" He says, "No, I did not." Well, I said, "You're going to have to explain that." He says, "I'll be honest with you." He says, "I really did forget." He says, "I've been trying to forget since this happened." But he says, "And I'm not very proud of it. But the wife and I were upstairs hiding under the bed when this happened."
Wow.
And I said, "Hiding under the bed?" I said, "From what?" "I don't know," he says. But it was low over the house. It was so loud, and the house was shaking like an earthquake. Now, next door, remember, these people are on the lawn. They hear nothing. The RCP officers watch it. He radioed other cars in the distance that watched it from distant places on hills and drove by. Think about this, right? Pretty crazy. I was saying, shaken. I said, yeah, go on. And he said, well, it just went on and on and on. He says, I thought we were going to die. And he says, let me tell you, he says, I'm a naval architect for the Canadian Navy. I designed the buildings at the Shelburne base. And he's going on. He said, I fly in Sea Kings and Labradors all the time, but I don't know what it was. I knew it wasn't from here, and it was close, and we were terrified. And I was just so glad that it ended. And I said, and how did it end? He goes, that's this crazy thing. It went on and on and on. He said, and then there was just like somebody flipped a switch and it stopped. He goes, and that's when I heard somebody knocking at the door. And I go down, and it was the RCMP officer. He wanted me to step out. He said, I looked past him and I could see the Websters on the lawn, so I wouldn't come out. So he said, no, I did not see anything, but that's how I remember it. So I ask you, what was that? Now, if I had just been communicating by email, this case would not have opened up, right?
Right.
I would not have heard the wife trying to say, "No, dear, that
Yeah.
was the night." You see what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Better still, face to face. So I went out after that and did follow up. There's one of the biggest lessons I ever learned in investigation. The more intimate, the more personal, by far, you're better off, right? So when a case comes, I try to get as close as I can. I try to find the two big things I do. That's one. The second thing is this. I try to find out what else that you wouldn't think of that would back this up. Like if something happened on the coast, is there a lighthouse record? Are there ships that pass by? Would there be logbook entries, right?
Right.
Residents that lived here at the time. I've gone around and knocked on doors. Here's a real quick example, quicker than the other one, of what that tells you. I tried to follow a cold case about these close encounters of orange orbs on the beach that were paralyzing people and interacting with them and children in that area of Nova Scotia. I knocked on doors trying to do a general survey of people that were living there at the time. One of the first places I knocked at, a woman opened the door and has a baby in her arms. He was crying, and she's like, I tried to explain to her who I am and what I'm doing. And she says, oh, God, it's all you hear down there is UFOs. And she says, I'm sick to death of hearing about them. She goes, I've never seen a UFO, and I don't know why people get all worked up about this. She says, I just know what my mother always taught me is when the orange balls are on the beach and you see them, you don't go near them. Have a good day. Wish you all the best. Goodbye. It was actually in that area, it was so common, that it was part of, general safety for kids that you told.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
that's cool.
This is not what you see like on TV or on the X-Files or the many specials you see. But when you get out of the armchair and you engage with the people, this has been the experience I've had. And, those are the moments you get that tingle on your neck when they're telling you this
Right.
stuff. Or
Yeah.
more than that, when you see it yourself. And you think about it. Yes, I saw something when I was 12, the night of the Shag Harbour incident, right? And think about that. 29 years of re-investigating, I finally find that the Shelburne story is a separate case from 1960, and my father was on the mission. He took it to the grave. And, one thing connects to another. So follow-up is everything. And like you say, those are the two big things. Find all the sources you can, get as intimate, as personal as you can, and leave no stone unturned.
That's perfect. So we've already kind of spoken about misidentification, weather phenomena, whatever.
Sure.
But how do you respond to skeptics who argue that there's always a rational explanation for these sightings?
Obviously, these are people that haven't investigated UFOs.
Oh,
There
for
is
sure.
not obviously a rational explanation, and they will usually readily admit that, right? But I mean, I've had cases in the past, particularly with astronomers. There are exceptions. I must admit that when I do presentations, I've often had at the end astronomers, who you would know the name, come up after me and congratulate me and say they find what I do interesting. And they say, you honor the scientific method. And I try to, and I do that, but you have to go beyond that too. And we live at a time when science tries to keep itself pure and separate from all these other outlooks, right? But I'm sorry, Isaac Newton was an alchemist. You know what I mean? Like Sir Charles Darwin was a clergy. You know what I mean? And people were much more complicated, much more accepting back then that you could wear these different hats, right? And in trying to keep it so pure, but I mean, if you go out and investigate UFOs, what you understand, what you can discern and account for through science, well, is going to very soon be challenged, right? Listen, most cases are misidentification. Natural phenomena probably accounts for the lion's share that's rare conditions and poorly understood. But if you get out there, it's like the case I described, in Lower Sackville there from the 70s. I call it the Webster case. I mean, come on. Nobody knew I was going to knock on the door. These people didn't get along. You want to talk about pure? That case is pure, open,
Yeah.
and unsolved, right? And science will not
Right.
solve that. Right. That's how I look at it. Yes, you have to account for science. You have to use that approach. And I would suggest that if once you get out in the field to do the work and meet these people and see something for yourself, if you should be so lucky, and really go through the record, you're going to find that you have to go beyond science. But no, you
Sure.
can't leave it behind. You have to account for it, right? Yes.
100%.
That's my view. Yeah.
Okay.
Are there any recurring patterns of behavior of UFOs that get reported to you?
Yes, and I find that I bumped into a lot of patterns that are not reported. Strangely enough,
Okay.
right? For
Yeah.
example, one expression I often encounter is when people just try to describe the light given by a UFO, particularly if it's something like an orb and it's small and they're close, but it could be a large craft. Is they'll say it gave off a really bright light, but it didn't light anything. It didn't illuminate anything, and they struggled to describe the quality of the light. They go, it was a really bright light, but it didn't help. It didn't give any light. Like I hear that all the time, right? Yeah, and then orange orbs are certainly a big thing. White, orbs. I mean, you see things like that, but often to describe some of the features, right? Which is one of the reasons why sometimes too you have to avoid language. I mean, when it's good to take one of those graphs where you have all the colors that are possible and shades in it. And when I ask them what color is, I get them to point that out rather than just rely on, oh, it was sort of a mauvey purple, right?
That
Little
makes sense.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some of these practical things can happen quite a bit because my yellowish orange might be your orangish red or something, But
Yes.
yeah,
Yes, it's
yeah.
true.
So little things like that. Some things you can't correct that way easily, but it's all a challenge. Yeah.
Okay.
What are
I do.
your thoughts on like USOs and the underwater
Uh,
base for?
well, I mean, my biggest case so far is the Shelburne USO case from October 1960, and I've only known that was the date since 2022. And it was almost 2023, but during the holidays, I finally made the breakthrough. I've been looking for 29 years to make sense of that case, and most people thought it was actually part of Shag Harbour and the ending of it, something I never quite accepted and kept searching, right? And like I say, just a few years ago, I finally got to the bottom of it and found that in 1960, at Shelburne Harbor, there was a NATO mission with 18 warships, 10 U.S., 8 Canadian, plus a Canadian diving platform. And I can name all the ships, and I have the ship's log for the command ship, which was HMCS Cape Scott, which my father was a medic on the ship at the time. He never told me the story, kept it from me. And what I discovered was in this case that these men went down and found two USOs sitting on the bottom at the mouth of Shelburne Harbor out beyond McNutt Island. And they were doing a mine sweeping training mission. And they went down for some strange sonar returns and to check it out. They were in only 6 fathoms of water, just over 40 feet. And they claimed that there were two USOs sitting there with live aliens in the water and that they filmed them. And this
Wow.
was turned over
That's
to the
so
Defense
cool.
Research Board on Grove Street in Dartmouth.
Yeah.
And that, I've been hearing this story from various sources for 29 years, but it was then that I found the name of the mission, the ships that were involved. And, the book I wrote, Sweep Clear 5, which is named from the name of this mission, it's a very complex case. And, the first full half of the book is just all the things I did that failed and how hard it was to track this down. Because unlike Shag Harbour, I mean, these cases are very different. They involve water. One is a purported crash of a USO offshore that had multiple witnesses, RCMP and Canadian divers involved. It was a headline story back in its day across North America, right? Including the Chronicle Herald, which was the first to run the headline, and that was Canada's most conservative broadsheet. Usually, you don't see UFO, USO stories on the cover.
Yeah.
But as I talked to the men over the years in the reinvestigation, this Shelburne story kept going. And whereas everybody would talk openly about the Shag Harbour incident, when you touched on the Shelburne case, they quickly became fearful or slammed the door in your face and said, "Man, we can't talk about that one," But
Yeah.
I heard all the stories. I interviewed the divers and some of the Air Force personnel involved and others. But, you could not, none would divulge the name of a ship or, the date or whatever. And it took me 29 years to get to the bottom of it, to sift through Canadian naval records and find it. And to be honest, it started with a single sentence in an article on Wikipedia that I'd missed. But here's another good investigation lesson for your audience or wannabe researchers, or the real ones for that matter. Always remember that wikis change and update on the internet, unlike a
Right.
book, right? They update. And when I looked up, I had this dream, and over the holidays, I described this in great detail in the book of when I was 5 years old, and it was just a recounting of a real event. And I remember hiding under a table and listening to my dad's naval friends talk about this. But, you're 5, right? It's all kind of soft,
Yeah.
not fully understood, but it was there. And when I woke up, I thought, stupid dream, and I didn't put any credence in it or the Shelburne story. And I'd probably had variations of that over the years since. Now, remember, when I'm 69 now, when I'm hearing this, I was 5, right? So, but what I did wonder about, because I'm meticulous about naval history and understanding it, is I thought, my God, what was Dad's boat at the time? What was the category? I knew it was a supply ship, but it was more than that. It was some kind of floating naval command center, and it was, Canada still had a 60-ship navy. I know it had other function, and it was a large ship. So I went to Wikipedia and just flipped the laptop open, put in HMCS Cape Scott, and it comes up, and I'm reading about it. And at the end of the paragraph where it talks about the service history of the ship, there's one sentence that says, in 1960, HMCS Cape Scott took part in a NATO military exercise in Shelburne Harbor known as Sweep Clear 5. And that's all it said. But as soon as I saw that, I knew. And the reason I knew is because I'd spent years going through naval records, and not once could I find I went through the whole Navy, and I went back as far as 61. Yes, I stopped at 61 because I didn't think it could be earlier. And, other researchers had helped me with this, for sure over the years, from Don Ledger to Graham Sims to whoever. And I got back that far, and I saw this, and I knew right away, because in all those years, I'd never found a ship's log put a Canadian naval ship in Shelburne Harbor. So now, here just in the single sentence, I'm hearing there's a NATO mission with 18 ships, and I think, oh my God, that's it. So where do you go from there? And ironically, this is during the time of COVID and between the holidays, everything's closed, right? But a few days later, there was an old secondhand bookstore in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia here that was open. I went there. I went through old copies of The Crow's Nest, right? That was a Canadian naval magazine. And I figured, in those days, take a month or two to get in. I kept going back and I found a copy from December 1960. The cover of it had the Bounty on it, HMS Bounty, from the movie made with Marlon Brando and whatever. They built a replica ship in Lunenburg. And when I open up and I go through the book, I find this article and it names all the ships in Sweetwater 5 and what the mission was. And yeah,
Wow.
in this naval magazine. No mention of USOs or aliens, right? It basically said, and a good time was had by all we love working with our American friends on these missions and blah, blah, blah. The shtick, the typical.
Yeah.
However, when I went back to Wikipedia and looked up the service history of some of the American ships involved, like USS Yazoo, well, it wasn't quite the same story there. First thing I read is that the command ship on this mission ran into trouble. Engine failure, was going to run aground in Shelburne Harbor, had to be rescued. They were ordered out of the harbor immediately, and, totally at odds with this Canadian article, the U.S. coverage. When I looked at ships that were listed, they weren't all listed, but USS Yazoo, which rescued Cape Scott, and another ship that was in trouble that had suffered material damage and casualty. And then you had,
Wow.
quite a discrepancy. Same with USS Orleans Parish, a big ship. So anyway, then I began the process through COVID, and that was hard dealing with a government department. Normally, within 30 days, you can get a ship's log or whatever. And I requested the log from the time frame. It took 7 months to get it. And when I get it and start sifting through it and going through all the naval jargon and entries of a ship that's commanding 18 ships, and we were in command because we were in Canadian waters, right? Well, I get to the time where I can remember the divers when they told me the story saying, look, when we were just starting to sail through the swept passage, they laid a field of dummy mines 8 miles long at the entrance of Shelburne Harbor. And they had to get the mission would be a success if they got the Cape Scott and the Orleans Parish, the two biggest ships, to sail through them and not get hit by a dummy mine that would record it would have exploded. He said, we only got an hour into mission, and the way the divers kept telling me, all hell broke loose. We went down, they didn't believe us when they told us on the surface what we're seeing. So we started to film it, and I knew the men and the names of the men. I remember them coming to the house and visiting my dad because he used to dive with them, but he wasn't a diver by trade. He was a medic. Anyway, so I get back to the point where the mission's all set up, the ships are getting ready, and I wait for them to start entering the passage. So I figure this must be the day they're talking about when the encounter occurs. And I can remember these guys saying, now when they're telling me the story, by the way, and that was back in 1994, it's already 33 years old. It's now over 60 years old. But I remember quite well, I took notes, right? And, I see that, look, an hour in, they say all hell breaks loose, but their memory's three. So I went 60 minutes in, I'm looking at all the log entries, nothing. So I keep going. I'm starting to get a little disappointed. I get to around 90 minutes into the mission, and I see something. I must have read it 20 times before I'm thinking, checking with a magnifying glass, but no, the log entry's clear. It's not smeared or whatever. And I see something that supposedly has never happened in history. They declare DEFCON 1.
Wow.
1. Yeah. Now, if you go back to Wikipedia or something more scholarly, you'll find if you just put in a read about the DEFCON system, you put DEFCON in capitals and read about it and the history of it, the highest we've ever been is 2. Like movies usually get it backwards, 1 to 5, but 5 is peacetime, all things at their lowest level,
Yeah.
right? And if you look at it, and of course, the only times you were at two was during things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Pretty serious incident, which was 2 years after this. And by the way, handled in the Canadian Navy by the same admiral who handled this mission. He was flown out from Maritime Command to the ships when this occurs. That's in there. But again, nothing about USOs or why they declare DEFCON 1. And the captain puts a special stamp in and has to sign for it. Well, supposedly, that's never happened. DEFCON 1. I mean, you're good to go. That's like you're ready for nuclear war if need be, right? Why? Why? And those ships don't move for a week. They just sit there over this spot from there.
Wow.
Right? So, I knew this was the incident that lined up with all the various stories, and I had to go back and do it. And that's what the book is about, and that's what it's about. And right now, I'm working on a project where I actually hope, and yes, it's a long shot, but I've been lucky with long shots where I hope to engage the security systems of our Five Eye partners, and I'd like to think that somebody wants to retrieve this film from the Canadians here, right, which they've not admitted to holding. I know who shot the film. I can name the man. I know what doctor they gave it to at the Defense Research Board on Grove Street, and these kind of details that aren't in the book, some of them, I'm going to pass along shortly. I'm working on a project with somebody else who's helping me with it. And we're going to submit this to all the Five Eye partners and think that, these kind of things should be shared, at least among them, if not with the public. And that's perhaps another step to it there. But yeah, I think I'm prepared to have egg on my face on this, but you know what? I believe these men. I believe the veracity. I believe that, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and you need DEFCON 1 on a diving mission in Shelburne Harbor in 1960, there had to be a good reason. And all the questions that arise, like, could it be a Russian sub? No. In 40 feet of water, you could have probably reached over the side and knocked on the conning tower. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, these things just don't hold up. The other thing is the penalties are so severe for not reporting an enemy ship near a NATO operation like that. It's right in the flap of the book, and I've got a copy of that and the rules and what happens. And yeah, so everything old is new again. People say, Shag Harbour, what does it mean? I'd like to say, why did you do it? Why did you put yourself through it? I'd say, well, I think Shag Harbour was a success, that case. And I'd like to prove there's life after high school. I'm not an academic. I had no post-secondary, but I can do it. And I said, and they go, what about Shelburne? I go, I like to prove there's life after Shag Harbour.
Perfect. So, Chris, we're coming to the end of the podcast, but I've got one more question for you. So recently we were interviewing a Bigfoot investigator, and we asked him what would he do if he had definitive proof that Bigfoot existed. So I'm going to kind of twist that question a little bit because he did say that he didn't want to jeopardize the species, so he wouldn't make it public where he saw, found, whatever. So if you had categorically evidence that an alien basically, you were face to face with one, you'd be able to communicate. How would you deal with that? Would you make it public or would you keep it to yourself?
I would make it public. I don't see why I wouldn't. Because I would make it public and let the public do with it as they would. I mean, the thing is, I don't bend any arms. People can believe, they can not believe, they can embrace or not embrace. Some people, even then, won't care. There are people who walk amongst us, and some of them it's hard to understand. I've certainly encountered them. I've encountered them on these missions where, like, they don't care. I'd say, well, what did you think about this when you're on the mission? And when I talk to one of the admirals or the captain of the ships, and I have interviewed them, and they're like, well, we just turned it over to the Defense Research Board. The eggheads came, and we handed them the data. You know what I mean? They don't. I said, you don't care if it didn't interfere with the mission. I don't care. I'm a Navy.
Yeah.
That's how some people view it, that it's not significant. I know in the field and scientists, we tend to say, we take this approach, even like people like Carl Sagan, who was a closet ufologist, I believe, in a way. You know, they're like, everything will change and it's profound and it defines who we are. But there are many people that don't feel that way. The world will go on, it'll change, like, if we knew definitively. So I think what I'm saying is, what you're saying really is, Chris, if you had the kind of evidence that would convince any skeptic, you know, and that alone, I'd have to have that fun and release it. But I think we should all know and weigh it for ourselves. Those who care will care. Some will care more. A lot of people won't care. Life will goes on. We'll still mistreat others. There'll be the problems of the world.
Oh, for sure.
For some people, it will enhance their life and their outlook, and that will it change? Makes me think of that old science fiction story. I think it was Stanley Weinbaum, the day after the day the Martians came. And you see all the same old problems and prejudices and everything go on.
Okay.
It'll be profound to some, not to others, right? And
For
I'll
sure.
let them decide. But why should I hold it as a person? That's what's
Right.
wrong all around. That's what's been whatever. It's been held, and who has the right? I've seen people take some pretty profound things I found out to the grave with them. And listen, I respect. Look, at the introduction to my book, Sweep Clear 5, I say how much I respect the men, that were on these missions, that dealt in the Cold War with these things, that had to encounter and deal with the unknown while not being allowed to acknowledge its very existence, right? And I just as equally honor those who decided to take their secrets to the grave. You know what I mean? It was a different time, a different thing. And there is more difference in this world between 1960 and 67 than 67 and now. By 67, the Americans and the world had lost its innocence. After the assassination of Kennedy and his brother and Martin Luther King, it was a different world, right? Nobody was blinded. In 1960, people respected and believed their government. You can't even imagine that now. Don't ask me. Yeah, very different world. You have to see these things in context. Yep. Study the UFOs, but study the humans too.
Oh, 100%.
In the context.
Yeah. Okay, Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Yes, thank you.
I think Megan's definitely learned a lot because she's such a big UFO buff.
I love it.
So I'd like to thank you again for coming onto the show. And
thank you for your interest. It's always, I never tire of it, and it's good to see young people in the field coming in and that, Megan. And I know there's somebody in Halifax I'm hoping to engage with on this project recently, probably about your age range and female, that I'm looking forward. We need fresh blood in this field and a fresh outlook,
Awesome.
That's awesome.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah. Thank you.
You.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.